action is one that, I'm glad it's being recorded, great. According to a standard statement of objective consequentialism, a morally right action is one that has the best consequences. And more generally, given a choice between two actions, one is morally better than the other, just in case the consequences of the first action are better than the consequences of the second action. And these are not just the immediate consequences, they're the consequences in the long term, perhaps until the end of history. Now, this account glides easily off the tongue, so easily that one may not notice that on one understanding, it literally makes no sense. And on another understanding, it has a startling metaphysical presupposition regarding counterfactuals. And I will bring this presupposition into relief. Objective consequentialism has faced various objections, including the so-called problem of cluelessness. We have no idea what the consequences of our actions will be. They could be catastrophic, they could be wonderful, they could be anywhere in between. I think that objective consequentialism has a far worse problem. Its very foundations are dubious. And even granting those foundations, a still worse problem remains, I'll call it clumsiness. And I think these problems quickly generalize to a number of other moral theories. I mean, I'd be delighted if I could take down all moral theorizing today. I won't be quite so ambitious. I will focus mainly on objective consequentialism. Problems are most obvious for it. And I'll consider three ways that it might be improved. I'll appeal instead to not too specific short-term consequences of actions. That's the first possible improvement. Second, understand consequences with objective probabilities, not counterfactuals. Third, understand consequences with subjective or evidential probabilities. And I'll say more about all of that soon. Now, if you're following along on the handout, we are up to the beginning. Actual or counterfactual consequences. Driver writes, consequentialism is the view that the moral quality of an action, for example, the rightness of the action, is completely determined by the action's consequences relative to the consequences of alternative actions open to the agent. And we nod along with this statement. I mean, maybe we think there are some problems with the view, but at least we think it makes sense, I guess. Graves characterizes objective consequentialism thus: A1 is objectively better than A2, if and only if the consequences of A1 are better than those of A2. And she refers to C better. That's her term of art for what matters to consequentialism. Okay, now notice that this implies that both A1 and A2 actually have consequences. And such statements of consequentialism are entirely familiar, but do they make sense? Okay, consider a moral choice that you face. You could help an old lady across the street, or you could go to the pub. And let's suppose, in fact, you helped the old lady. Did you do the right thing? Now, I'm happy enough to allow that there's a fact of the matter of the total value of the consequences of your action, the thing that you actually did, helping the old lady. But what about the thing that you did not do? You did not go to the pub. How good are its consequences? Now, taken literally, that makes no sense. There are no consequences of an action that's not performed. So immediately we encounter a problem with the very statement of objective consequentialism and its generalization when we compare one action with another. Okay? They just don't make sense as stated so far. And I've been giving you completely standard characterizations of consequentialism. Just look up encyclopedia articles, handbook articles. You'll see they, time and time again, they say things exactly as I've presented them. And I say they literally make no sense. At a given choice, you actually perform only one action, so only it has consequences, period. Okay, so that's my first main point. So it seems the statement should instead involve counterfactual actions and the consequences that they would have if they were performed. And I think that's the most charitable understanding of the literal nonsense. So we could also, I suppose, stipulate a technical usage of consequences which builds in their counterfactuality by fiat. In any case, let's just say it properly. Let's say it carefully. A morally right action is one that would have the best consequences if it were performed. For example, on the handout, there's Tanzio's statement of utilitarianism. An action is right if and only if in the situation there was no alternative to it which would have resulted in a greater sum total welfare in the world. And now you hear the counterfactual. Just saying the counterfactuals makes me get a sore throat. Now, given a choice between two actions, one is morally better than the other if and only if the consequences of the former action, if it were performed, would be better than those of the latter action, if it were performed. And again, this glides off the tongue all too easily. And again, I think there's an underappreciated but fatal problem. And I'll develop the problem in two ways, depending on whether the world is indeterministic or deterministic after the time at which the action is performed. Now, if you're following on the handout, we're up to indeterminism. Okay, first, let's assume the world is indeterministic thereafter. And that seems rather plausible. It seems that the world has myriad chancy processes, such as coin tosses, lotteries, various natural processes, not to mention quantum mechanical events. Okay, focus on an action that you did not perform. So in my story, going to the pub, you did not go to the pub. It's merely hypothetical. If you had gone to the pub, how would the first non-actual chance process thereafter have turned out? So let's fix our ideas. Let that first hypothetical chancy event be the first non-actual coin toss thereafter. Okay? If you'd gone to the pub, the coin would have landed heads, not tails. Right? That was a joke. I want you to be struck by the implausibility of this claim and perhaps even to laugh at it. Because after all, no, if you'd gone to the pub, the coin would have landed tails, not heads. Okay, that was another joke. Equally implausible, equally laughable, or so I say. After all, if the coin, and this time this is not a joke, if the coin had been tossed, it might not have landed heads. It might not have landed tails. That's what chance is all about. Now, I disagree with the usual Stalnaker-Lewis style semantics for counterfactuals in terms of similarity of antecedent worlds, but it's a useful heuristic that helps me convey my point. Okay, on this approach, the counterfactual, if it were that P, it would be that Q is true just in case all the most similar P worlds are Q worlds. Well, among the most similar worlds in which you go to the pub are some heads worlds, some tails worlds. They're not unanimous either way. So it's false that the coin would have landed heads. It's false that it would have landed tails. Okay? The worlds disagree. Or consider the first non-actual lottery to be played after your non-actual trip to the pub. Again, you never went to the pub, right? Suppose the lottery would have had some large number of tickets, numbered 1, 2, 3, etc. If you had gone to the pub, ticket number 17 would have won. Okay, it's another joke. And it remains a joke, whichever particular number is claimed to be the hypothetical winner rather than some other. For any ticket, I say it's false that that ticket would have won if you'd gone to the pub. It might not have. Or in similarity of worlds speak, the most similar worlds in which you go to the pub don't all agree on which ticket wins the lottery. Some say ticket 17, some say ticket 18, and so on. In fact, all the tickets get their day in the sun among the most similar worlds. Okay, on the handout, I talk about this. I say that the counterfactuals are false, but an important alternative view says that they're indeterminate. Stallnacker thinks there's always a unique, most similar, closest antecedent world. But in cases like this, it's indeterminate what it is. Now, I don't want to insist on my view that the counterfactuals are false. It suffices that Stallnacker and I can agree that they are not true. For Stallnacker, it's laughable as well. It's a little bit like laughing at Sherlock Holmes had an even number of hairs, not odd, at Reichenbach Falls, okay, which is indeterminate on a popular view about truth in fiction. Indeterminacy is problematic enough for objective consequentialists to the extent that they're committed to there being facts of the matter for such counterfactuals. I mean, look, maybe they could say that there's rampant indeterminacy about whether a given action is morally better than another in almost all cases. But that's a huge bullet to bite. It's often platitudinous what the right verdict is. Look, it's true that donating to Oxfam is morally better than going on a serial killing rampage. And please don't tell me, oh, it's indeterminate. No, it's just true, right? And any view that says otherwise is absurd, perhaps even pernicious. But I've barely begun. There's recently been a cottage industry of observing just how significant an effect on subsequent history our actions have, even mundane or trivial actions. They have ripple effects. And they're not merely like the ripples on a pond caused by a stone's throw, which dampen down and quickly disappear. No, on the contrary, the ripple effects of our actions are ongoing and they amplify. Our actions affect the identities of future people for the rest of history. These identities depend on the fine details of which sperm happens to fertilize an egg on particular occasions. And changing the details changes the nature of the conceptions and hence the identities of these unborn children. So, for example, a tiny change in your action might just slightly delay the moment of a conception. And that's enough to change the identity of the future child. Parfit makes much of this, Graves makes much of this. And it's plausible that such conceptions are yet more chance events, more lotteries in a broad sense. So if you had gone to the pub, you didn't. Consider the first non-actual child to be conceived thereafter. I say it's false of any particular sperm that it would have won its race to the egg, its lottery. It's false that this child would have been conceived rather than some other. But I've barely begun. Now consider that hypothetical child's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on for the rest of history. Consider all the non-actual people's interactions with all of these hypothetical descendants and all of their hypothetical descendants, and so on. All of their hypothetical interactions. I find it highly implausible that there's a truth of how all these chance events would have turned out if you'd gone to the pub. I mean, I thought it was crazy to think there was even a fact of the matter of how the untossed coin would have landed, let alone the entire rest of history. But I've still barely begun. Now, I'm going to say that a lot. It's even less plausible that there's a truth of what the magnitudes and durations would have been of all the joys and sorrows of all of these non-existent people, or whatever else counts as consequences. After all, these depend on the resolutions of yet more chance processes. This poses a dilemma for objective consequentialism formulated counterfactually. If it admits that the relevant counterfactuals are not true, then it will go silent in many chancy cases where it should speak and even shout from the rooftops. Its ethics is compromised. If it insists that the relevant counterfactuals are true, as I believe it standardly does, then its metaphysics is compromised. Let's pursue the latter horn more. We are up to determinism. Now, so far I've been assuming indeterminism after your pub jaunt. Now let's assume determinism, which you might think is the best hope for objective consequentialism. And now, given a precise specification of the initial conditions and the laws of nature, we get an entire history determined thereafter. So from a snapshot of the world at the time of your choice of going to the pub, the rest of what happens in the world lawfully follows. And now it might seem more plausible that there's a truth of what would have happened if you'd gone to the pub for the rest of history. But now a different problem kicks in, the unspecificity of the antecedent. If you'd gone to the pub somehow or other, well, how exactly? And now I find it implausible that there's a particular way that this loosely specified antecedent would be realized. If you'd gone to the pub, you would have entered it at 6:03 p.m., 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds. Okay, that was a joke. No, you would have entered it at 6:03, 24 seconds and 18 milliseconds. You're getting the idea. These are all jokes, right? This is absurd. And now I'm drawing attention to the implausibility of these counterfactuals because they're implausibly specific. They hitch together an inexact antecedent with an all too exact consequent. If you'd gone to the pub, you might not have entered it at 6:03, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds. So it's false that you would have done so. And so it goes for any putative exact entry time, or said in Lewisian terms, the most similar pub worlds do not all agree on your exact arrival time. Some have it at 17 milliseconds, some 18, and so on. But yet again, I have barely begun. There's no truth of who the first non-actual child to have been conceived would have been. No truth of which sperm would have fertilized which egg if you'd gone to the pub somehow or other, and so on. For the subsequent non-actual lineage of this non-actual child and all the non-actual people with whom they would interact and all the non-actual people with whom they would interact and so on. Now, an objective consequentialist might reply they don't need to commit to a specific counterfactual history if you'd pubbed. A range of counterfactual histories is fine as long as the total value of their consequences is sufficiently delimited. So, for example, suppose all of them would have consequences whose total value, and I'm trying to use my hands to indicate this, the total value falls below the actual total value of helping the old lady, the consequences of that. Then you did the right thing. However, the chips might have fallen, helping the old lady was better. Going to the pub was down here. Helping the old lady was up here. Well, this is a forlorn hope. Our everyday actions may have radically divergent effects on the total values of subsequent history. This is bread and butter in the cottage industry. In one hypothetical history, after your hypothetical pubbing, the children that happen to be conceived are a series of latter-day Buddhas and Einsteins, and a wonderful world ensues. You know, things are way up here. But with just a tiny tweak to the details of your pubbing, we get another hypothetical scenario in which the children that happen to be conceived are a series of latter-day Hitlers and Stalins, and a nightmarish world ensues. You know, things are way down here. And with other tiny tweaks, we get a broad spectrum of total values in between. Some of these scenarios are comparable with the total value from helping the old lady. Some are much worse, some are much better. So there are not even moderate bounds on the total value that would have resulted if you had gone to the pub. And there's no truth of whether helping the old lady was better or worse. Yet as before, the exact details make all the difference, as it might be if you'd entered the pub at the 17 millisecond time, a series of moral saints and geniuses would have been created. But if you'd entered the pub at the 18 millisecond time, a series of moral monsters and charlatans would have been created. There's acute sensitivity to the exact initial conditions of the value of what would follow thereafter. Again, bread and butter in the cottage industry. So even under determinism, with an unspecific starting point, there's no fact of that value, nor even moderate bounds on it. Instead, there's a vast portfolio of live possibilities regarding what it might be. The exact details make a world of difference. We get huge world differences. Now, as I've been understanding objective consequentialism, it's committed to the truth of a staggering set of counterfactuals concerning the consequences of non-actual actions. I say such counterfactuals are false. Followers of Stalnaker say that they're indeterminate. Either way, they're not true. Such counterfactuals had better not be the foundation of morality. We are up to cluelessness and clumsiness. Now, at this point, a consequentialist might reply, look, Alan, there is a truth of how exactly you would have entered the pub, the exact initial conditions associated with your pubbing, from which the rest of counterfactual history deterministically follows. Well, let's suppose this for the sake of the argument. I won't be so concessive soon. There's still a serious problem for objective consequentialism, one that's worse, I think, than previously recognized. The recent literature on objective consequentialism makes much of the so-called problem of cluelessness. We can never have the faintest idea which action would have the best consequences. All right, let's suppose that your 17 millisecond arrival time would initiate a history rich with latter-day Buddhas and Einsteins. Your 18 millisecond arrival time would initiate one burdened with latter-day Hitlers and Stalins. And the problem is supposed to be that we could never know these facts or have justified belief in them. This is an epistemic problem. But this understates just how bad the situation is for objective consequentialism. Look, suppose we could somehow solve the problem of cluelessness. Suppose God just tells you these alleged facts. Then what? The trouble is it's simply not under your control to realize these conditions in one precise way rather than another one. So much as you may want to arrive at the 17 millisecond time, that's the good one, you cannot so finely tune your actions so as to do so, rather than arriving at the 18 millisecond time. You're clumsy. When it comes to these extremely fine-grained actions, you're a klutz. These exact arrival times are not genuine options for you. You cannot decide to realize one rather than another. And the actions that consequentialism evaluates should not be mere behaviors. They should be options that you can decide among. What God tells you is not action guiding in the sense that we should care about. Well, we could put this as another dilemma. It's on your handout. Depending on how fine-grained the objects of moral evaluation are. First horn of the dilemma. Suppose that they are somewhat coarse-grained things, like you go to the pub. Well, then it's plausible that these really are options of yours, but it's not plausible that there's an entire counterfactual history uniquely determined thereafter, given the unspecificity of such options. Second horn of the dilemma. Suppose the objects of moral evaluation are precisely specified options, like you go to the pub at 6:03, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds, not 18. Well, then perhaps it's more plausible there's a truth of the entire counterfactual history thereafter, but it's not plausible that these options are things that you can decide among. They're not genuine options. That's why I'm using the scare quotes and the high voice. Options. They're not options that you can deliberately realize or not by an act of your volition. Your clumsiness renders you unable to realize one of these options instead of its near neighbors by an act of your will. So either way, objective consequentialism founders. We are up to it's not just about you. But yet again, I have still barely begun. I've engaged in an act of pretense in order to convey a point, but the reality is worse. So far I've pretended that under determinism, an exact specification of your pubbing would determine a unique counterfactual history thereafter. And Graves explicitly endorses a generalization of this thought. It's on the handout. Assume determinism. Actually, I'd rather not assume it, but okay, let's assume determinism. Then for any given sufficiently precisely described Act A, there's a fact of the matter about which possible world would be realized, what the future course of history would be if I performed A. Well, this is far from clear to me, for you are just a tiny part of the world. In the sweep of world history, you are just a speck. I'm sorry if this comes as news to you. Even describing precisely the details of your going to the pub, the millisecond of your arrival, and so on, that falls stupendously short of determining the entire world's initial conditions at that time. And under determinism, it's the initial conditions of the whole world and the laws that entail the rest of history. The initial conditions of a minuscule part of the world, such as the arrival of one person in a pub, does not even come close to being a sufficient input for such an entailment. After all, what's going on elsewhere would also play a huge role in determining the identities of the hypothetical people that we're supposed to imagine. And those hypothetical people would interact in all sorts of ways, creating more hypothetical people who would interact in yet more ways, and so on, so on. And never mind the people. Don't forget about the hypothetical dogs and frogs and bees and trees and photons and protons, not to mention hypothetical pandemics and natural disasters. Now, this is an even more dramatic version of the problem of unspecificity of the counterfactuals antecedent. To get an entire history to follow from the specification of initial conditions under determinism, you would need to specify an entire time slice of history, not merely some tiny part of a portion of a fragment of a time slice of history, the details of your pub going. Even the exact specification of your pub going is just a minuscule sliver of the slice that's required. Now, previously I found it highly implausible that there's a fact of the matter of exactly how you would have entered the pub. If you'd gone to the pub, you would have entered it at 6:03, 24 seconds and 17 milliseconds, and other jokes. I didn't say they were good jokes. Objective consequentialism, a la Graves, is committed to something I find even more implausible. If you'd gone to the pub, the entire world history would have been blank, with exactly one way of filling in the blank. Your action would make a tiny contribution to world history, given everything else that would be going on. So all the more I find it highly implausible that merely fixing your action nails down the rest of history. And again, this is not a problem of cluelessness, a problem that, oh gosh, it's hard to know this history. It's not merely an epistemic problem. Rather, it's a metaphysical problem. There's no particular history that would ensue. Although, of course, this implies there's nothing to know. The world itself is clueless. So I submit that the metaphysical foundations of objective consequentialism are highly dubious. The statement of it might glide easily off the tongue, but when we scrutinize it, I think it falls apart. But suppose my critique is completely mistaken. Somehow or other, the foundations are in good order, despite everything I've been saying for the last half an hour or so. Well, then I still submit that objective consequentialism has jaw-dropping metaphysical commitments that have not previously been appreciated. We should have done a double, triple, quadruple take at the very statement of it, rather than nodding along with its easy breezy wording. And only then should we have begun to discuss familiar objections. We are up to generalizing the problem. Now, the heart of the problem is objective consequentialism's appeal to facts regarding the long-term consequences of actions that are not performed. And according to this theory, they are all that matters. The moral status of an action is entirely determined by such consequences. But a version of the problem will arise for any theory for which such consequences count for something. Graves writes, any plausible moral theory will agree that considerations of consequence goodness are at least morally relevant. They should be taken serious account of, both in moral decision-making and in moral evaluation, as at least one important factor. Even most deontological theories give some moral weight to the consequences of actions. For example, a deontologist may acknowledge that while one has a pro tanto duty to keep a promise, this may be overridden if the consequences of doing so are sufficiently dire. Rawls writes, all ethical doctrines worth our attention take consequences into account in judging rightness. One which did not would simply be irrational, crazy. Now, to the extent that these are long-term consequences, the problems that I've raised for objective consequentialism will kick in. It makes no sense to speak of the consequences of an action that's never performed. And it's a jaw-dropping metaphysical commitment to appeal to counterfactuals about what the long-term consequences would be if the action were performed. To the extent that deontological theories make such an appeal, their foundation suspect. Likewise, virtue ethics must traffic of actions to some extent. Hursthouse and Pettygrove write, it should go without saying that the virtuous are mindful of the consequences of possible actions. How could they fail to be reckless, thoughtless, and short-sighted if they were not? But again, an action that is merely possible does not have consequences at all. That's nonsense. And long term, for those who are not short-sighted, counterfactual consequences are as suspect here as they were before. The problems of cluelessness and clumsiness will also recur for any moral theory to the extent that it acknowledges the significance of long-term consequences and attempts to characterize it with counterfactuals. And again, there's acute sensitivity of the consequences to the exact way an action is realized. To the extent that the consequences matter, this acute sensitivity will matter. Yet you're clueless about them and you're clumsy. You have limited control over your actions and you cannot, as an act of the will, realize them one particular way as opposed to some neighboring way. 17 milliseconds, not 18. And as before, a dilemma arises for these alternative theories. If the objects of moral evaluation are rather coarse-grained options, then it's implausible that there are facts of the matter about how they would counterfactually be realized. If they're very fine-grained options, then it's implausible that you can decide to realize one rather than another. And as such, it's implausible that they really are options for you at all. And consider, again, the best case for there being a fact of the matter of what would happen were you to act in some non-actual way. That was determinism. And again, we may specify as precisely as we like the details of your hypothetical action, but what would then happen depends on much more than you. It's not all about you. For the rest of history to follow, a snapshot of the entire world at that time is needed, but all we have is a selfie. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I don't want to overstate it. To be sure, deontology and virtue ethics are not as beholden to the consequences as consequentialism is. But given how perilously the consequences may vary depending on the fine details of what you do and what the rest of the world does, even various versions of these ethical theories risk foundering. Where do we go from here? Now, so far, my discussion has been almost entirely critical. How did we get into this predicament? Let's return to objective consequentialism as I've been understanding it. And three moving parts led to the problems I've raised. First, it appeals to the highly specific long-term consequences of actions. Two, it understands consequences with counterfactuals. Three, it's objective. Accordingly, I want to briefly consider three ways we might improve it. One, appeal to not too specific short-term consequences of actions. Two, understand consequences with objective probabilities, not counterfactuals. Three, understand consequences with subjective or evidential probabilities. I think the third way still fails. The next two are more promising. They're the best hope for consequentialism. So let's look at not too specific short-term consequences of actions. Now, remember, I found it highly implausible that there's a fact of the matter of highly specific counterfactual consequences until the end of time that would have transpired if you'd performed some action, gone to the pub. It's much more plausible that there's a fact of the matter of the not too specific short-term consequences of your action. If you were to help the old lady across the street, she would be significantly happier for the next few minutes. If you were to go to the pub, you would have fun for the next hour or two, and so on. And such claims are straightforward common sense. Now, in a longer version of this talk, I'd actually argue even those counterfactuals are false, but that brings in my own sort of crazy views about counterfactuals being generally false. I won't presuppose that here. Anyway, look, this respite for objective consequentialism is short-lived. Imagine a psychopath contemplating hooking up a doomsday device to be activated if a coin landed heads, but not if the coin landed tails. The potential consequences are short-term. They may be rather unspecific. The world would be destroyed somehow or other immediately if the coin landed heads. Business as usual, more or less, if the coin landed tails. So, what would happen if the psychopath did his deed? Well, it's not the case that billions of people would die. They might not, each scenario happening with chance 1/2. So even short-term, not too specific consequentialism fails to capture the wrongness of this deed. This version of consequentialism might fare better than a long-term specific version in more mundane cases, such as helping an old lady or going to the pub, but it's still untenable. So we're up to 2, understand consequences with objective probabilities. I think that probabilities are in better order than counterfactuals. I prefer to formulate consequentialism in probabilistic terms, as various authors do, for example, Jackson, Graves. In particular, the notion of expected value or expectation is probabilistic. It's a weighted average of possible values, the weights being given by conditional probabilities. The value of a given possibility is multiplied by its conditional probability of being realized, given an action. The expected value is the sum of such products. In your choice between helping the old lady and going to the pub, the right action is the one that has the higher expected value. And we get rid of the problematic counterfactuals altogether. Now, of course, this shifts the problem of understanding consequences counterfactually to the problem of understanding probabilities. But I say we have a vast literature on the interpretation of probability to draw on. And in particular, we may distinguish objective probabilities, chances, subjective probabilities, credences, and evidential probabilities, degrees of confirmation. So I suggest that objective consequentialism should be formulated in terms of objective probabilities. That should not sound so surprising. And this is on the handout. A morally right action is one that maximizes expected value, where the weights are conditional chances at the time of choice. And more generally, given a choice between 2 actions, one is morally better than the other, just in case the former's expected value is greater than the latter's. Well, you might ask, will the problems that I raised for objective consequentialism formulated with counterfactuals, will those problems reappear when it's stated in terms of objective chances and objective expectations? No, or at least not to the same extent. There's so much to say about this, so little time, but briefly. What about non-actual actions? Now, remember, I observed there are no consequences of an action that is not performed. That's just nonsense. But there are chances of consequences conditional on such an action, and these are actual chances. They're features of the world. What about the metaphysics? We have a vast literature on the interpretation of objective probability to draw on. And there's much to say philosophically in favor of chances. And we're plausibly committed to them anyway from science. Science traffics in what I would call chances. In any case, I need only a commitment to comparative chances, one chance being greater than another. And that's less of a commitment than to numerical chances, because what matters at the end of the day are comparative expectations. This expectation is greater than another. I don't need the exact numbers. Okay. What about clumsiness? While outcomes are often acutely sensitive to initial conditions, the chances of outcomes are more robust. The outcome of a given coin toss may depend sensitively on exactly how it's tossed, but the chances of the outcomes are relatively stable, a half. Okay, if I say, how will this coin toss land? Very hard to predict. What's the chance of heads? That's much easier. And you don't have to ask, well, hang on, Alan, who's tossing the coin today? How high are they tossing? No, it washes out. And that's what makes chances so theoretically powerful. They're sort of resilient in a way that the outcomes are not. Conditional chances are even more resilient. They're even more robust. And inequalities between conditional chances and correspondingly between expectations are more robust still. And again, remember, what matters are the inequalities between the expectations. You don't need the actual numbers. Okay. Now, small variations in your exact arrival time at the pub will make no difference, or almost no difference, to the conditional chances of latter-day Buddhas or Hitlers being eventually conceived, and still less to the comparative conditional chances, the inequalities between them. So your clumsiness about your exact arrival time should not matter. What about cluelessness? Well, again, I say thanks to the stability of the conditional chances and then correspondingly the expectations, the relevant facts about them are more easily known than the corresponding outcomes. So to be sure, we'll typically have no values of the requisite conditional chances and the exact values of the expectations. We don't need to know the exact values in order to know whether one action is better than another. That's merely a matter of the inequalities. And we'll often have clues about that. Finally, and my time's nearly up, which is good that I'm nearly finished. Understand consequences with subjective or evidential probabilities. So now the obvious move is to replace the objective probabilities with subjective probabilities, those of the agent in question. And that brings us to Jackson's decision theoretic consequentialism. The morally right action for this agent is the one that maximizes subjective expected value. The weights are her conditional credences. And now, not just anything goes for the credences. I assume that they're rational. On the handout, I mention a constraint that involves aligning your credences with the corresponding chances to the extent that you can. It's called the principle. And I think that the problems that I raised for objective consequentialism formulated with counterfactuals are mitigated or even entirely solved. So again, non-actual actions, no problem. We have credences for consequences conditional on such actions. I think the metaphysics of credences is in good shape, even better than the metaphysics of chances. We'd better be happy with credences. They're a staple of much of philosophy, economics, psychology. Clumsiness won't be a problem. For almost any rational agent, their exact arrival time in the pub will make no difference to their conditional credences of latter-day Hitlers and what have you. And assuming that we have introspective access to our own credences, we're not clueless about them and with them the requisite expectations. My time is up and I am finished. So just to conclude, consequentialism reformulated. It's time to put all of this together. Objective consequentialism should not speak of the consequences of actions that are not performed, let alone comparisons involving them. That's nonsense. Nor should it traffic in counterfactuals about what the consequences of such actions would be. That betrays a commitment to dubious metaphysics. Rather, objective consequentialism should be formulated probabilistically in terms of expectations. Now, replace the chances by credences, and we get subjective consequentialism. The distinction between the two kinds of consequentialism neatly follows from the corresponding distinction between two kinds of probability, objective, and subjective. And this brings me back full circle to where I began this talk. I said that foundational issues in probability and counterfactuals bear crucially on moral philosophy. We've seen that the very formulation of consequentialism, and perhaps of moral theories more generally, bring in their train a host of such issues. But I've barely begun. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. So I guess we have around 40 minutes for Q&A. So if you want to ask a question, you can just use the, I believe, reactions and then raise hand, and then I'll just call on you from here, and I'll need to unmute people as well. So let's see, why don't we start out with James, and I will keep track of people as you raise more hands.
Great, thanks. Sorry if there's banging in the background. There's construction. Yeah, thanks for the talk.
Sorry if there's barking in the background. There are dogs.
I didn't hear anything. Okay.
Yep.
So about the objective probability view that you outlined. So I'm just wondering if maybe all different options would just end up having something like an infinite expected utility or something like that, just given the how the endless effects of our acts, right? So this person would be born, then that person would be born, that person, and so on and so on. So I'm wondering if sort of the values would get swamped in some way. So all the actions would end up having sort of the same expected utility.
It's very interesting. I got you. And especially if the history is infinite, which actually we should take very seriously. Good cosmology, serious physicists think that the world is infinite, and there are infinitely many points of value, in which case you'll get infinite sums for these expectations. I take it that's your point. It's a little bit like the St. Petersburg paradox, if you know what I'm talking about there. That's a famous paradox involving infinite expectations. So that's a very good question, and it's definitely something to take seriously. This would be a whole other talk that I would have been glad to give, but I've thought quite a lot about infinite expectations. I was the co-author with Harris Nova of a St. Petersburg-like paradox called the Pasadena game, and that involves sort of problems with infinity as well. And I'm pretty fond of bringing in heavy technology to help with these cases. So there are various ways of having more nuanced infinite sums using so-called hyperreal numbers or surreal numbers. So there's some heavy-duty technology from mathematics that can help give you nuanced answers to these infinite sums. For example, I've written a bit about this in connection with Pascal's wager, which involves an infinite utility. And I actually drew the figure 8 infinity, didn't I? That one's unnuanced. That one, if you divide it by 2 or you add 1 to it or whatever, you get the same figure 8 infinity back. But it doesn't have to be that way. There are other formulations of infinity where you actually make distinctions. For example, for the surreal numbers, omega divided by 2 is different from omega. Omega plus 1 is bigger than omega, and so on. So I guess I would try to help myself to some heavy-duty technology like that for the infinite sums. Now, I have to confess, for some of the really heavy-duty stuff, I'm somewhat clueless myself because it gets formidably difficult. But I do feel there are answers there. I hope that speaks to your question. Yeah, thank you.
Yep, thanks a lot. And I'm more clueless than you, so that's very helpful. Thank you.
No worries. Yep.
Okay, next we have Jesse. Okay.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. So thanks for the talk. At the beginning and near the end, you made this claim, there are no consequences of an act not performed. And to think otherwise, you say, just doesn't make sense, or it's just nonsense.
Yeah.
But I think this overlooks a big part of ethics about acts of omissions. which do seem to have consequences.
Yep.
So suppose I promised my friend Dan that I'm going to take care of his cats while he's away.
Yeah.
But I don't perform that action. I don't take care of his cats. This has consequences. I broke a promise, and there might be some dead cats. So what do you have to say about acts of omission?
Yep. No, very good question. So definitely I see the worry. Yeah. They're by definition absences. They don't happen. They seem to have consequences. So what I would say is what really has the consequences are the things that you did instead. So you did not look after the cat. You did something else. You went to the pub. One of the consequences of your going to the pub was that the cat died. We're imagining, okay? And that was what was morally wrong. You did this other thing. So I would say that you can speak of consequences here. It's not literally the omission. It's not the absence of the cat, feeding. It's the thing that you did instead when you should have fed the cat. That's the thing that has consequences, or at least we're imagining. And
it's kind of counterfactually though, right?
Well, actually, no. If what literally happened was you did go to the pub, it has consequences. And in your story, one of the consequences is the cat actually dies. Mm-hmm. I take it. So that, yeah. I hope I didn't appeal to a counterfactual there. So that would be the way I handle it. But it's a good worry. By the way, omissions, they're a problem for everyone in a way. Theories of causation generally struggle with them. Theories of moral responsibility struggle with them. So it's completely fair to raise them, but I don't think it's sort of uniquely a problem for the views that I'm espousing. And I think sure. I have something of an answer.
Sure. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Faye.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So my question is related to that your solution about using probabilities to address the Cluelessness problem. So my question is, well, in your handouts, the case that you refers to is like coin toast case, which seems to me is a simple case in which that we know the outcome, right? There's just two outcomes, head and tail, and it's easy to assign a objective probability, and of course credence. But I think classical moral actions are more complex than coin toast, and that's the original Cluelessness challenge. Is well, not only doesn't know the the probability, we even doesn't have any clue what all the possible outcome of a particular action, which is very specified, described action. What are the all possible outcomes? So James Layman used this one case, which is the Hitler case. Is well in like thousands of years ago, a person who make a choice between killing someone or refrain from killing someone, and he chose refrain from killing someone. But in doing so, after a few generations, one of the descendants of the person who survived is Hitler, which caused a catastrophic outcomes to the world. And also he said that, well, there are some action which we perform are in those complex systems in which that initial condition changes, it will have massive different outcomes. And those action in which, like outcomes is completely, we are in a very bad Cluelessness situation of knowing those possible outcomes. And that definitely affect of, we assign a credence or chance to the outcomes. And I would just interested to know how you would address this kind of more complex cases in which that where Cluelessness is even more severe, and how the subjective probability, objective probability solution can help. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and thank you. And just to repeat, the main point is it's all very well for me to talk about, say, a coin toss. That's easy, but in these real world, hard choices was clueless. I want to make progress on this hard problem. So I claim there were sort of 3 steps, and I suppose we should go through them slowly. First, chances are easier to know about than outcomes. The coin toss was meant to sort of make that vivid, but I hope it generalizes. So look, it'll be something like the chance of a wonderful history given Buddha is born is greater than the chance of a wonderful history given that Hitler is born. Okay, so that's the first step. Second step was to say, but I don't need chances, I need just conditional chances, and the condition packs in a bit of extra information. So they're a little bit easier to unpack. So given some more information in the condition, now what are the chances? That's a little bit easier still. But then the key move was what really matters are the inequalities, not the numbers. Now, and of course, we have to then convert the chances into expectations. Some issues there, but with a little bit of waving my hands, I guess I'm literally waving my hands. I think we can make progress. So I'm claiming I know that the expectation is better, higher for my donating to Oxfam than it is for going on a serial killing rampage. I don't claim to know the outcomes. I don't claim to know the chances. I don't even claim to know the conditional chances. I just claim to know an inequality between expectations. Now, if I'm wrong about that, then I think we really are in trouble. Okay, and then we should just probably abandon consequentialism altogether. But I do think this is its best shot, and that's what I was arguing for. So I've claimed in 3 steps I've made things better than the original cluelessness problem. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Adam.
Great,
Adam.
thanks for the talk. Yeah, so I think I was pretty sympathetic to what you're arguing, but I have a question that's maybe in a certain sense just a terminological question. Maybe the easiest way in is just, why at the end of the day do you still so you frame the talk as if there's this problem for consequentialism and that you're going to come up with sort of revisionary versions of consequentialism as a way of dealing with it. But I guess it seems to me that maybe these views miss something that's actually quite essential to consequentialism as it's ordinarily thought of, because I kind of suspect that the idea you're attacking is really kind of the core idea of consequentialism, right? Like the notion of an action's having consequences, determinate consequences, sort of presupposed, I think, in the way that consequentialists tend to think about morality. And if we're replacing the actual consequences of an act with, say, the objective probabilities, it seems like you get sort of situations that from a consequentialist perspective can look a little bit odd. Like, say there are 2 actions, A and B, and A has a higher, A has a higher objective likelihood of like resulting in a certain amount of utility or something like that.
Yep.
Like it seems like what we want to say about the goodness or badness of that outcome doesn't just depend on what its like, chance of its eventuating in that was, but in like how things actually turn out. So like someone might do an action that had a high objective probability of having a good outcome, but then we might get really unlucky, and we sort of want to say retrospectively that like what that person did was bad, and like that's kind of the key idea, you might say, of consequentialism, that a person could be in a situation where they do what they think is best, but it does end up being bad. But But if we just say the action was good because the objective probability was high, then the worst disaster on earth could befall us, and we could say that was, you know, do we say that was still a good outcome, or what that person did was good? These don't sound like great things to say, but
it sounds a little better if you say
understanding.
the person did the right thing. They were very unlucky, as it turned out, but
Yep.
that might help a little bit. But look, spot on. I definitely get it. In fact, let me flesh out the story. So you help the old lady, and let's just agree that the expectation was high of what you did, namely the chance was high of a good outcome, and you know, better than the expectation of other things like going to the pub. But as it happens, like sadly, the old lady fell and broke her leg, and it was a terrible outcome. Or even to pursue a sort of Lenman style thing, maybe the old lady makes it safely across the road, but as a result, you know, the next conception, because of the delayed cars or what have you, is a Hitler, and away we go, and it's a horrible history. And so to speak, you got unlucky. So all of that is completely fair. So it helped a little bit, I hope, when I said you did the right thing, even though, as it turns out, you know, you were unlucky and there were some bad consequences. Maybe that's losing the spirit of consequentialism that really takes seriously. It's what happens that matters. But then we got to be careful of the nonsense, because we have to compare it to something else. Now, that other thing, well, it's not literally what happens. That's nonsense. You know, you can help yourself to the counterfactuals if you want to be, you know, knee deep in metaphysics, or neck deep. Well, better to opt for the chances, I say, and the expectations. So now, here's one thing that I might say, but maybe I'm not completely happy. I can compare the actual history. I actually helped the old lady, and there is a fact of the matter, unbeknownst to me, but there's a fact of the matter of the total consequences and how good they are until the end of time. And now I can compare that with the expected value of the thing that did not happen. But why I'm not quite comfortable with that is it's sort of a hybrid theory now. It's sort of, you know, expectation on one side and actual consequences on the other. But I don't know how to avoid that, because gosh, there are no consequences on this side. So I don't know what else to appeal to rather than, you know, their expectation. And now if I do expectations on both sides, it's not a hybrid theory anymore. It's sort of playing fair. It's not giving any privilege to the actual. It's comparing expectation with expectation. But then your problem exactly kicks in, that what I do might have a high expectation, but it could turn out very badly by bad luck. And it does seem that the consequentialist focuses on the latter rather than the probabilistic thing. So I think that's it's a great problem to raise. And again, I mean, gosh, if this isn't good enough for the consequentialist, then I just don't know where else to turn, because I think the other options are worse. But I think you would like to come back in. You're frozen at a moment of, you know, ready to say something profound.
I'm suggesting that there's maybe nothing, there's not all that much that's consequentialist really about your proposals.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what is high expected value? Like
Yeah.
That's not really about the consequences of the act. Like, in a way, what you're arguing is the notion of the consequences of the action doesn't make any sense. You should focus on something different. And it's structurally similar to consequentialism. But I think what you're arguing is consequentialism is committed to this sort of picture thinking idea that in every possible world, there's like a big part of it. We can call that part of the possible world the consequence of my action. And attached to every one of those parts of the world, there's a number, you know, the value of the action. And you like pick the one that's, you know, highest, and that's the right one. And then if you explode that picture, then there's kind of nothing really left to the idea that it's like the consequences of the action that are the like good making feature, the truth maker of the judgment.
Yeah. Look, thank you. That's great. Maybe I shouldn't have such an upbeat conclusion. Maybe I should say, look, this is the best shot at making sense of consequentialism. It's not really consequentialism. That's I think your point now, and it's got these other problems anyway. I wanted to still call it consequentialism because it's taking an expectation of consequences. It's not focusing on other things like virtues or, obeying the rules or something. It is looking at consequences, just probabilities and expectations over them. So it is a kind of consequentialist view in that sense. But you're right, it's not quite the original thing. But the original thing, I don't know. I don't think I can make sense of it. Anyway, look, thanks. That's very helpful.
All right, so we can start a new round, but I want to sneak a question in here quick. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the it's not just about you kind of worry. Because I was thinking about it like follows. So I was thinking maybe, so suppose God tells me that there's these actions that I can perform I'm walking, I see the old woman crossing the street, and I see my favorite pub, and it flashes before me that I have these options. And so I pick one of them, maybe just set aside worries about clumsiness or whatever. So I pick one of them and I'm walking to the pub. So I guess the way I'm thinking about it is there's some little tiny part of the world, of the cosmos, that I control, and the rest of it is outside of my control. So by the time I get to the pub and enter at 8.17 milliseconds or whatever, I would have thought that the state of the world is a function of my choice or my control over whatever little part of the world I control, maybe my body, plus, the antecedent forces that were acting on everything else. And I was wondering, in a deterministic framework, why isn't that enough to determine precisely what the whole state of the world is like when I get to the pub?
Yeah, excellent. Let me say it back to you. Divide the whole world history into two parts. There's the part that I have some control over, and then the rest that's out of my control. And if we specify the exact details of my pubbing, say, we get the story about how the stuff out of, under my control unfolds, and the rest, we don't want that just remains fixed. After all, I don't have any effect on it. So I guess you just import the way that turns out in the actual world. That would be the natural.
Well, you import the initial conditions for everything else, because obviously I'm going to move the air molecules and things like that. But I was thinking you just keep the initial conditions for everything else and me, and then just change the kind of time worm of my walk to the pub or whatever. Does that not determine?
Yeah, it's okay. I think it's still going to be tricky. So remember, this is assuming determinism, and I said regarding Graves, I'd rather not assume it, but let's assume it. So I actually helped the old lady. I did not go to the pub. So now how do we get me to go to the pub instead? Well, we have to either change the laws of nature, or we have to change the Big Bang. We have to go all the way back in history. Those are the only two options under determinism, right? I hope that was obvious.
Yeah, so I'm imagining like a tiny little miracle happens in my brain or something like that. Whatever, I forget exactly how it's supposed to go, but a little miracle happens, and that's why things go different.
A little miracle, and I see, and there's a unique little miracle. So the next worry is, but there are different, equally little miracles, and there'll be ties for how similar they are, so to speak. And on one version, one little miracle, you get Hitlers, and on another you get Buddhas. So I guess now there has to be the further claim. There's a unique little miracle. That's the one that
I see. Okay, this is helping me understand. So is if I could just, is one way of putting the point that when we had when you move from the objection from cluelessness to clumsiness, the idea was like, even if God told you what the options are, you wouldn't be able to they wouldn't be live options in some sense.
Yep.
Is it a consequence of this kind of worry that not even God could come up with a list of options because there's just no fact of the matter about what the options are per se? I mean, there are all these different miracles, and there's no sense in which their choices, even for the most precise kind of agent, you don't get to choose how the laws or how the miracle happens or something like that.
Yeah. So that's what I think. So to put it colorfully, as you just did, not even God knows, because there's nothing to know. There's no fact of that matter. But I should say that there's another pretty influential view, and it's getting a real revival these days. It goes back to the medievals. It goes back to the Molinists, and it's the so-called doctrine of God's middle knowledge. And so the idea from them was, for any action, counterfactual action, God knows how things would have turned out if you'd performed that action, okay? And he's omniscient, right? That's, I guess, the thought. And he's not just omniscient about what actually happens, he's also omniscient about these counterfactuals. And then you can quickly add to that, and he doesn't just know, the small local details. He knows the whole history of the world for any possible action of yours, like you're going to the pub. God knows the whole history. Now, this view's come to be called counterfactism. Forget about God. Just what matters is there's a fact of the matter of these counterfactuals. And it turns out there's quite a few philosophers these days who are running with this view. John Hawthorne had a paper about this. It follows actually from the original Stalnaker semantics, if you know that. So Stalnaker assumed there's always a unique closest antecedent world. So for example, there's a unique closest world where I go to the pub. Well, it just dictates everything. Just look at what's true in that unique world. There's your whole history for you. John Hawthorne runs with that idea. Ori Stefansson coined the term counterfactism, or counterfacts at least. I coined counterfactism for the view. Counterfacts are these facts that God allegedly would know. Sarah Moss, Richard Bradley, a few people have run with this view. I'm just now sharing with you, I find that a wild metaphysics. These are primitive modal facts that God allegedly knows. Okay, they do not supervene on the non-modal stuff. So for example, the non-modal stuff does not determine which way the chancy coin goes. And yet there's a fact of the matter, a counterfact. It'd have to be a primitive modal fact. And there are going to be a lot of them. So for all of these alleged counterfactuals that God allegedly knows, it's a primitive fact that God knows. Okay, well, we're getting pretty metaphysically committal. And it gets worse because presumably the counterfacts themselves could have been different. They're contingent. So there'll be counterfactuals about how they could have been different. So now we have sort of second order counterfacts about how the first order counterfacts could have been different. And the second order counterfacts could have been different. And away we go. We have an infinite regress of these primitive modal facts. Okay, some people love to be committed to, lots of primitive modal stuff. I'm less keen, but I feel that that's where this is going. I feel that'll be a consequence of assuming that there are these unique worlds that you would get for any antecedent, and that's a heavy commitment. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. We can start a new round now. I don't know how much time we'll have time for, but we can start with so face hand first, and then Raph, and that'll probably be all we have time for.
Yep, I'll try to answer faster too if it helps.
Sorry, me first. Oh, okay. Hi, sorry. I have another question, maybe also like a bit follow-up of what your answer to my first question is you suggested to solve those complex cases. A possible solution is instead of focus on accurate number of expected value, more plausible is just to have a like inequality, which one has a greater like. I think it's very plausible and a promising kind of direction. So I was thinking kind of another proposal which it seems not mentioned here, but I kind of wondering what you think whether it's a plausible way to go. Is you mentioned there's the problem which what leads to the feature of objective consequentialism, which will lead to the problem is if it appeals to highly specific consequences, and then instead the consequences in terms of counterfactual, and then your solution is, well, then we focus on non-specific short-term consequences and instead consequences in terms of probability. And also I see that for objective consequentialism, or at least the traditional one, it's also focused on highly specific actions. The actions, you know, of like, for example, killing someone, but, you know, killing someone in a specific context, so specific actions. But I mean, intuitively, if we're appealing to action which is less specific, like in more general, like just type action, like killing someone, killing innocent person, more general and less specific. Intuitively, it seems easier to come up with some kind of more accurate probabilities. And because we only need a equality, so the equality will be more likely to be accurate than something we focus on highly specific action, because obviously, you know, the higher the specific, the less likely we will know the specific consequences and of the you know the probability correspondingly. But more general, the more likely we'll come up with something like more accurate in terms of probability and consequence. So what do you think about the kind of another kind of ways of handle this is to shift from focus on very specific, highly specific action to more general actions?
I think another way of putting your point is that you've put together two of my solutions at the same time. So there was the first proposal was go unspecific and, you know, shorter term. And I had some worries about that. And then I went to the second and third proposals in terms of probability. And now I think you're putting them together. I think you're saying, let's focus on, you know, not too specific actions and now, you know, probabilify them. And that should be easier, and it should be, there shouldn't be such problems of cluelessness, maybe not such problems of clumsiness either, because it's not a specific action. It's not a particular millisecond that you have to arrive at the pub at. It's just, you know, somehow or other you go to the pub. That's easy. I'm not clumsy about that. And so it all fits together. So that's a very nice proposal. Again, thank you. So I should have really offered that. Having offered 1, 2, and 3 as the solutions, maybe the best solution is to put them all together, which you've just done. So thank you for that. And yep, so I think that's an improvement. Now, when it comes to my own credences, my own subjective probabilities, I'm not sure if it makes much difference whether you stick in a specific action or an unspecific action. You know, what's the probability that a Hitler is conceived given that I go to the pub somehow or other? I don't know, I have some value for that. What's the probability for Hitler being conceived given that I go to the pub at the 17 millisecond time? I guess for my credences, it's going to be the same, because I don't know, the millisecond didn't make a difference to my opinion. So maybe it won't make a difference on that side. It's more likely to make a difference on the chance side, where the chances might be more sensitive to particular realizations. But anyway, it's a nice idea, and thank you. That really I should have concluded by putting them all together. And that's the best hope for consequentialism. Yeah, nice.
Okay, thanks. And we have Raf as our last question.
Okay,
Yeah,
right.
if there's still time,
Bring it.
I'll try to keep it short, just 30 seconds or so. So I want to come back to something you said in response to Adam earlier on about whether this is really consequentialism that you are proposing or reformulating. Namely, in response, you said, well, I'm still dealing somehow with consequences, only probable consequences, or at least I assign probabilities to consequences, right? But I wonder if these are necessarily consequences when you're talking about expected value. I mean, consequences in the sense of causal consequences. And because they don't need to be, unless maybe you think of consequence, or sorry, you think of causes as probability raisers or so. So I wondered if there was maybe a certain theory of causality in the background, or if maybe supplemented with a certain theory of causality, you could bring back the spirit of consequentialism, which maybe assumes that there's some kind of a causal relation between the actions and the morally relevant consequences.
Yep. Very, very good. You cut out occasionally, at least on my computer, but I got the message, and thank you. So the main idea was, should I be thinking of consequences causally, and maybe do I even have a probabilistic account of that? Something just to share with you generally, I have a probability first view of everything, of the world, right? You know, Tim Williamson. So wherever I look, I want to probabilify it. So when I see causation, I want to go probabilistic there, exactly as you said. I think this is another good issue to raise for consequentialism. At least the classic statements that I looked at never mentioned causation, did they? And it seems a bit funny that, you know, I am on the hook for all of this stuff that happens in the world, you know, most of which I didn't have any causal role in whatsoever. You know, I helped the old lady across the street, and then, you know, somewhere else a Hitler's born, and somehow that's part of my score for how well I did. So I think a good way around that is to look at the causal consequences, the things that I cause. This is a bit related to an earlier question too, about how you could sort of factorize the universe into the parts that I'm causally responsible for and the rest, and put the two together and you get the whole of history. So that came up there. So I think that's also a good idea. And I didn't really mention it, did I? I think this is the good point for me to finish on. There are different decision theories. There's so-called evidential decision theory, and there's causal decision theory. Now, I assumed without much argument just the sort of vanilla expectation, which looks like evidential decision theory. But maybe really what I should have assumed is causal expectation in the sense of causal decision theory. And that's the figure of merit. That's the thing that I hope to maximize. So the theory of rational decision becomes a theory of moral action in terms of causal expectation, rather than just the sheer conditional probabilities, which is more evidential. So anyway, thank you. That's I think another good improvement to this view. I know we're about to stop, but let me thank you all. I've given this talk many times. I really think this is the best session I've ever had. I mean, just one good question after another. I feel every question sort of advanced the position further, and I'm really grateful for that.
Well, thank you very much. We're very, very pleased to have you here. Really enjoyed the session. I guess I was asking people, please join me in thanking our speaker, but you have to do it sort of silently through miming claps or just sending good vibes or something. But in any case, yeah, I'm very glad you were able to join us, and everyone is able to join for this session of the public lecture for the Hong Kong Catastrophic Risk Center. So thanks, everyone.
Look, and thank you very, very much. Great to meet you all, at least this way. I hope one day we'll meet in person. I love Hong Kong, so I'll be coming.
That would be great. We're not that far away, so
yeah. I would love to see you in person, talk to you more, because it was really a pleasure for me now. Thank you. Okay. All the best. Thank you.